The Galactic court hung like an iron cathedral, and Daniel Rook knelt beneath its cold lights, while fleets glittered beyond the glass. Archon raised one obsidian hand, and silence settled like frost. Victor Hale stared ahead, jaw locked, metals dull under the starshine. Mara Keen stood apart, immaculate and distant, as if the outcome had never concerned her. Selena Reese watched without blinking, sorrow veiled behind a diplomat's poise. Orion Vex lingered in shadowed tears, a ripple of presence that bent attention away. 1,000 projectors bloomed to life, and histories bled across the air. Archon said, "Sentence is extermination." Daniel's breath caught, but he did not bow his head. Victor Hale said, "Compliance preserves a remnant." Mara Keen said, "Humanity must be contained." Selena Riss said, "Judgment without balance becomes conquest." The court's light dimmed, and a susurrus passed through the galleries like wind over graves. Somewhere behind the pillars, a whisper threaded the dark. A voice said, "They are not just judging him, they are judging us all." Daniel steadied on bruised knees, and the fleets kept their patient orbit. The chamber waited for collapse, and found endurance instead. Silence spread through the chamber like a slow tide, and Daniel measured it with the rise of his chest. Archon watched for collapse, and found only a man refusing to blend into statistics. Selena Aris said, "Mercy does not annul law, but law must survive mercy." Victor Hale said, "Orders exist to spare lives." Mara Keen said, "Order exists to end uncertainty." Orion Vex remained unclaimed by light, patient as gravity. The fleets drifted in precise halos, their hulls reflecting verdict like scripture. Daniel tasted iron and old fear, yet his gaze refused the floor. Archon said, "Defiance decorates failure, not virtue." A courier drone traced a circle over his head, its camera irises clicking like teeth. The audience leaned forward, hungry for a falter that would excuse their comfort. Daniel breathed again, slower, and the hush grew dense. Somewhere behind the benches, a tremor of dissent stirred and flattened. Selena Aris folded her hands as if to shelter a flame no one else could see. The first confrontation arrived without theater, carried on measured words and the weight of rank. Archon said, "List the virtues that outlive your wars." Daniel answered without moving, "Names become bridges." The court screens cycled through ruined cities and hard-won rescues, each image asking for a single definition. Victor Hale said, "Sacrifice is arithmetic." Mara Keen said, "Progress is control." Selena Aris said, "Memory is warning." Archon descended one curved step, and the hall shivered as if planets noticed. Daniel's scars mapped years that statistics had failed to count. He spoke of nurses who burned their hands to carry strangers, and miners who shared air in collapsing shafts. A murmur collected in the galleries, and then stalled. Archon said, "Anecdote is perfume on rot." Daniel met the gaze above him, and the light did not blink. The screens turned, and the court awaited a collapse of meaning that did not arrive. Night deepened against the glass, and the galleries thinned to those who lived on procedure and spectacle. Daniel was escorted to the holding tier, steel underfoot, humming with distant engines. The cell door irised like a lens, and the air smelled of ozone and disinfectant. He sat without slumping, because surrender teaches habits too quickly. From the corridor, steps paused where shadows hardened. A voice whispered near the seam of the wall, neither hostile nor kind. The voice said, "If he survives tomorrow, the truth survives." Daniel looked to the speaker's slit, and nothing looked back. He measured possibility against trap, and found no spare answers. Selena Aris passed beyond the glass with a glance that carried a grave promise. Mara Keen signed a report without turning her head. Somewhere above, Archon revised the script of the morning. Orion Vex let the silence close like a net, and waited for the first tug. The chamber slept, but the sentence did not. Daniel traced the texture of the metal bench with his thoughts, counting scratches left by names he would never know. He considered the fleets like patient storms, and the cities waiting under their reign. Victor Hale said earlier, "Endure and obey," and the words still scraped like gravel. Mara Keeney had not looked at him twice, as if distance might spare guilt. Selene Aris had moved like a lantern carried through fog. Arkan Varys had spoken with the ease of gravity, and the hall had leaned to match. Daniel remembered a small voice in a burned stairwell, and a hand clasp that had refused to shake. He breathed until the air lost its taste, and then he breathed again. The door light pulsed once and settled. Somewhere in the darkness, a whisper lingered like a thread tied to morning. The night held him without comfort, and he refused to vanish inside it. The tribunal chamber faded into memory as Daniel Rook sat alone in the cell, and his scars became maps of stories buried in silence. His thoughts pulled him back to trenches of shattered cities, where fire ate the sky and rubble buried hope. He remembered comrades who vanished in smoke, their names carved only in memory. Victor Hale once said, "Sacrifice is survival," but Daniel carried faces rather than equations. Mara Keeney had once stood beside him in mud, but ambition had carried her far beyond mud's weight. Selene Aris appeared in his mind like a faint glow, reminding him that compassion had not yet died. Arkan Varys embodied judgment, but Daniel measured judgment against the hands that once reached for him in the dark. The silence of the cell became filled with echoes of laughter, cries, and fading breaths. Daniel pressed his palms together, not in prayer, but in refusal to forget. Memory struck sharper than metal as Daniel relived the night his family vanished in fire. He had returned too late, smoke heavy in the air, silence too absolute. The tribunal accused him of cruelty, but grief was punishment long before judgment. The taste of ash never left his tongue, nor the vision of a child's toy melted into slag. Victor Hale had tried to speak comfort once, but it was the comfort of numbers, and not of blood. Mara Keeney had looked away, unwilling to face loss not useful for strategy. Selene Aris, though not of his world, had spoken once, "Pain unshared breeds only silence." Daniel breathed against the memory, not to erase it but to hold it steady. The walls around him hummed with the power of alien engines, but inside, only memory roared. Daniel's scars were not only wounds of flesh, but betrayals carved into trust. He recalled the day comrades traded him for rations, leaving him in enemy hands. Their eyes had carried hunger, not malice, yet the betrayal cut deeper than blades. The tribunal displayed such stories as proof of human weakness, but Daniel knew they were also proof of desperation. Victor Hale once argued betrayal was currency in war, and Mara Keeney called it adaptation. Daniel remembered their faces trembling as they chose survival over loyalty. Selene Aris had murmured, "Sometimes desperation is louder than choice." He understood but never forgave. His voice carried those moments into the silence, each word defying erasure. In the chamber of judgment, betrayal was painted as inevitable, but in his memory it was both wound and warning. Daniel remembered a night when hope itself seemed to dissolve, when the sound of air sirens drowned faith. He had stood in a collapsing bunker, walls shuddering with each strike, believing the next breath would be his last. Yet in that despair, a stranger had shared a cracked mask, air enough for two. That moment, fragile as glass, remained unbroken in his mind. The tribunal did not play such fragments on their screens, for they were not crimes. Victor Hale said later, "Such chances do not alter wars." Mara Keeney insisted, "One life is not strategy." Yet Daniel held to that breath as proof that humanity was more than its violence. Selene Aris seemed to sense it, her gaze softer whenever he spoke. The chamber above accused, but memory carried its own defiance, bright as coals beneath ash. By the end of reflection, Daniel understood he was no longer only a man inside chains, but an unwilling symbol carved from wounds. He had not chosen to carry humanity, but the court had chosen him because he was broken enough to be dismissed, and strong enough to endure. Arkan Varys spoke as if history was verdict, But Daniel carried memory like armor. Victor Hale bowed to numbers, and Mara Keene traded loyalty for survival, yet their shadows followed him into judgment. Selena Harris remained the faint voice reminding him that mercy could still stand in halls built for cruelty. The tribunal's silence pressed like stone, but Daniel did not collapse beneath it. He carried scars not as excuses but as testimony. What they wanted erased became his only shield. What they wanted silenced became his only voice. Morning bled through the star glass as the court ignited its machinery of memory. Hollow arches unfolded, and 1,000 wounds stitched themselves into moving light. Archon Varys said, "Observe the essence of your kind distilled to harm." Daniel Rook stood as chains clicked, and the floor hummed with power and poise. Cities fractured, then looped, as if ruin were a season rather than a choice. Victor Hale said, "Losses counted to prevent the next loss," and looked away. Mara Keene said, "Control ends chaos," while her eyes tracked the crowd. Selena Harris said, "Evidence without measure becomes theater," her voice dusk soft. Orion Vex was a quiet eclipse on the balcony, absorbing every tremor of doubt. Screens painted massacres beside rescues, forcing mercy to share a frame with rage. A soldier lifted a child. A soldier burned a village. The splice was merciless. Archon Varys said, "Pattern is verdict," and the gallery leaned toward consent. Daniel tasted iron and dust, then said, "Context builds the spine of truth." No one answered, but the light did not dim, and the ships kept their orbit. The gallery devoured the spectacle, and the court fed it with edits honed to puncture doubt. A peace convoy flickered into a weaponized swarm, the timestamp curtained by glare. Daniel Rook said, "Rewind before the cut," but the controls were not his to touch. Archon Varys said, "We trimmed redundancy," and the word rang like a blade. Victor Hale shifted once, metals whispering, and said, "Data should remain whole." Mara Keene said, "Relevance prunes noise," and did not blink at the splice. Selena Harris said, "Precision is not brevity," and the hall cooled by a degree. Another clip unspooled, a riot that began with unanswered breadlines. The feed started at the first shattered window and ended at the sirens. Orion Vex watched the crowd rather than the film, hunting the direction of sway. Daniel counted frames by habit and heard the silence where cause should breathe. Archon Varys said, "Outcome defines origin," and the benches murmured assent. The edits built a tower of certainty, elegant and dangerously fast. Daniel stood inside it and refused to be the weight that made it stable. When Daniel spoke, the room answered with applause meant to sound like reason. He named the dates the edits erased, and the names the edits buried. Archon Varys said, "Emotion fogs sequence," and the lights cooled another notch. A projection of a firing line trembled, then sharpened to erase a pleading hand. Victor Hale said the hand must remain, and a brief fracture crossed his stare. Mara Keene said the plea is irrelevant to the count, and exhaled like steel. Selena Harris said, "Irrelevance often hides origin," and silence tilted toward her. Orion Vex smiled, where only shadows could serve as witness. Daniel described a nurse who crossed a street of fire with a blanket and a name. He said, "If you remove the walk, the blanket becomes a trophy," and the breath paused. Archon Varys said, "We measure result," and patience slid like ice across stone. Screens bloomed again, bright as verdict, but the color felt thinner than before. The applause did not return, and the room relearned how to listen. Daniel held his ground, a hinge the edits could not quite close. The pattern bent when a battlefield manifest misnamed a village that never stood there. Daniel saw it first, a wrong syllable polished smooth by repetition. He said, "The file inherits a lie," and the nearest screens twitched. Archon Varys said, "Clerical drift is not motive," but the words lacked weight. Victor Hale said, "Supply routes match the false map," and his voice roughened. Mara Keene said, "Errors scale when useful," and the benches stirred uncomfortably. Selena Harris said, "Correction is the first mercy," and touched a console for context. A secondary feed opened, raw and ungraded, and the village existed 2 kilometers west. The edit had shifted witnesses out of frame and rearranged night into noon. Orion Vex leaned forward, interest like a knife that wanted a sheath. Daniel traced the misfit clips and said, "Fabrication breeds convenience." Archon Varus paused, then said, "We will review provenance, a rare retreat." The gallery felt the floor move, and reached for rails that were not there. Doubt entered like weather, and the air found a colder honesty. Night reclaimed the glass, and the court dismissed no one, as if truth preferred insomnia. Guards led Daniel to the holding tier, where engines hummed like distant thunder. The cell embraced silence, and the edits replayed behind his eyes without light. A voice arrived from the vent seam, steady as a hand that would not tremble. The voice said, "Tomorrow they will test bone, not words, and call it proof." Daniel asked nothing, because questions cost more than the answers offered. The voice said, "Survive 6 dawns, and the chain will show its maker." Footsteps receded, careful to sound like ordinary patrol. Selene Eris paused beyond the glass, leaving a folded scrap that was only a blank. Mara Keene filed a notice that cited safety and meant pressure. Victor Hale stood in a corridor and stared at a map that no longer matched itself. Archon Varus rewrote the agenda, replacing debate with ordeal. Orion Vex smiled into a dark panel and let it reflect teeth rather than eyes. Daniel lay back without closing his gaze, and the night learned to wait. The next dawn carried no trial of words, but one of flesh. The chamber reshaped into an arena, its floor lined with burning sigils and iron rails. Archon Varus said, "Endurance is measure." Daniel Rook was unshackled only to be bound by tasks designed to humiliate. Chains hung from beams, weights pressed into his palms, and every slip was met with jeers from the benches. Victor Hale said, "This test preserves nothing but cruelty," yet his voice lacked resistance. Mara Keene said, "He must show worth through survival," eyes shining with cold calculation. Selene Eris whispered, "Endurance is not proof of justice," but her words barely carried. Orion Vex leaned on shadows, amused as though watching theater. Daniel steadied his breathing, scars straining, refusing collapse. He lifted weight, blood ran, and still the crowd demanded more. The tribunal called it judgment, but the walls smelled of spectacle, and Daniel understood survival itself was their feared truth. The trial escalated with calculated cruelty. Daniel was forced into corridors of fire where heat warped the air. Each step blistered his skin, and guards struck when he stumbled. Archon Varus said, "Pain defines resolve." Victor Hale turned his head, unwilling to watch. Mara Keene said, "Endurance is currency," her tone sharp with approval. Selene Eris said, "Cruelty breeds only silence," her eyes fixed on Daniel's bleeding steps. Orion Vex leaned forward, lips curved with hunger for collapse. The gallery murmured, recording each falter as if it were confession. Daniel whispered against his own breath, not in plea, but in refusal. Flames roared, chains rattled, and still he moved forward. The ordeal was no trial of guilt, but of spectacle designed to fracture spirit. Yet with each agonized step, Daniel learned what the tribunal feared most was not weakness, but the strength that survived pain. The ordeal did not end with flame, but continued with water that swallowed sound. Daniel was chained beneath rising tides, lungs burning as seconds stretched. Archon Varus said, "Survival without dignity is still failure," his tone like ice. Victor Hale clenched fists as if memory gnawed at him. Mara Keene said, "If he endures, he only prolongs the inevitable," her voice calm. Selene Eris whispered, "Every breath stolen becomes resistance, though few heard." Orion Vex tilted his head, eyes glowing faintly as if amused. Daniel's body trembled as water filled every hollow, yet his gaze rose through the waves toward the watching court. His defiance surfaced with every ragged breath clawed from drowning. The tribunal intended to break body and will, But Daniel revealed the truth hidden beneath cruelty, that survival was the answer no verdict could erase. As Daniel endured each torment, fragments of the tribunal's lies unraveled. Screens displayed altered histories, yet cracks spread when compared to raw records revealed by Selina Eris. She said, "Truth resists silence." Archon Varus replied, "Truth is dictated by power." Victor Hale said, "Then power fears what cannot be erased." Mara Keeney said, "Fear is control," her voice steady as stone. Orion Vex smiled, whispering only to himself, "Fear builds empires." Daniel stood, blood and water dripping, and said, "You fear not what we have done, but what we can endure." The gallery shifted, murmurs spreading like sparks in dry grass. The ordeal exposed not guilt, but conspiracy, twisting judgment into theater. Archon Varus tightened his grip on the gavel, but the weight of deception had begun to tilt the hall itself. The final revelation cut deeper than wounds. As Daniel staggered but stood, Mara Keen stepped forward with words sharpened for betrayal. She said, "This was never about justice, Daniel. It was always about fear." Daniel stared, blood painting his face like war paint, while the hall recoiled. Victor Hale whispered, "You chose this path," his voice filled with grief. Selina Eris closed her eyes, as if the weight of betrayal were hers as well. Archon Varus remained still, yet approval shadowed his gaze. Orion Vex's smile widened, hunger finally satisfied. "Mara Keeney," said, "humanity is reckless, and I will not burn with it," her eyes like glass. Daniel's chest heaved, yet his voice did not break as he said, "You have traded truth for safety, and safety for nothing." The gallery erupted, their whispers swelling like storm winds. The betrayal was no longer rumor but revelation, and the trial turned into conspiracy unmasked. The chamber returned to stillness, though its silence quivered with unrest. Daniel Rook, bloodied yet upright, stood with chains slack around his wrists. Archon Varus said, "You were measured in fire and water, and you did not fall. Explain why survival should mean absolution." Daniel lifted his chin, voice rough yet steady. "Survival is not absolution. Survival is proof of what cannot be erased." Victor Hale whispered, "He speaks with the weight of ashes carried." Mara Keeney said nothing, her betrayal unspoken yet felt. Selina Eris leaned forward, eyes bright with fragile hope, and said, "Listen to more than wounds. Listen to meaning." Orion Vex's smile glinted from the shadows, as if savoring the spectacle. The gallery leaned into Daniel's words, as though drawn by gravity. He straightened and refused to bow, ready to speak not to judges, but to galaxies waiting beyond glass. Daniel spoke, and his words cut sharper than steel. "You show our wars, but not our sacrifices. You display our cruelty, but not the hands that shielded children. Humanity is not perfect, but perfection has never endured a storm." The gallery stilled, breaths held in collective unease. Archon Varus said, "Sacrifice cannot weigh against atrocity." Victor Hale said, "Sacrifice becomes the marrow of survival." Selina Eris whispered, "Even those who condemn you hear what you carry." Mara Keen folded her arms, her eyes sharp as glass. Orion Vex said nothing, only studying how doubt spread like smoke. Daniel's voice rose again, carrying the stories of nurses in fire, fathers who stood before walls of bullets, and nameless hands that built bridges after ruin. The chamber trembled, as if those voices were speaking through him. Doubt stirred through the chamber, like cracks spreading across stone. Members of the gallery shifted uneasily, their eyes flicking between screens of atrocity and Daniel's steady form. Archon Varus said, "Doubt is weakness, and weakness cannot shape law." Victor Hale answered, "Then weakness has already reshaped it." Mara Keen muttered, "The longer he speaks, the more poison spreads." Selina Eris said softly, "Truth is never poison." Orion Vex leaned forward, gaze fixed on Daniel, as though measuring something beyond endurance. Daniel raised his voice, "You fear us not because of what we destroy, but because we rise again and again after ruin. That is what frightens you." The gallery erupted in whispers, and the silence of authority cracked as uncertainty took hold. The screens flickered, shifting from orchestrated cruelty to hidden truths. A projection revealed Daniel's lineage, a name tied to humanity's first explorers, a legacy erased from records. Archon Varys' eyes narrowed, his voice iron. "You are more than symbol, you are seed of defiance." Victor Hale whispered, "So this is why they feared him." Mara Keen said legacy does not excuse recklessness, but her voice shook. Celine Eris whispered, "Legacy is reminder, not excuse." Orion Vex's smile widened, savoring revelation. Daniel's chest rose with ragged breath, and he said, "I did not choose lineage, but I carry it, as I carry every scar. You feared us before we spoke, because you knew we would endure." The chamber erupted with voices colliding, no longer unified in condemnation. The trial fractured under the weight of unveiled truth. Chaos struck when a blinding flash cut across the hall, and Celine Eris cried out. A lone figure stepped forward, the innocent, their presence trembling yet unyielding. They shielded Daniel with fragile courage, whispering, "They cannot erase what survives in us." Guards lunged, and the innocent fell, struck down in sacrifice. Daniel's roar broke chains more than strength, his cry echoing across the hall. Archon Varys froze, momentarily disarmed by the unplanned sacrifice. Victor Hale shouted, "Enough!" Mara Keen turned away, her betrayal complete, but her eyes unsettled. Orion Vex leaned back, smiling wider as though every moment was his design. The gallery exploded in uproar, doubt becoming fire. Daniel raised his voice above the storm, "We are not asking for mercy. We are demanding recognition." His words struck harder than any weapon, burning into every ear. The verdict fell with the weight of iron, the word extermination echoing through the chamber like a hammer on stone. Daniel Rook was dragged forward, chains tightened until they cut into his flesh. Archon Varys said, "The sentence is final. Humanity ends today." The gallery erupted in divided cries, some shouting for blood, others for mercy. Victor Hale shouted, "This is not justice, this is fear." Mara Keen remained silent, her betrayal etched across her face. Celine Eris rose, her voice trembling, "You will ignite chaos across every star if you proceed." Orion Vex leaned back, smiling as though the storm was his design. Daniel's knees buckled, but he forced himself upright, his voice rough but steady. "You may kill me, but you cannot kill what we have already become." Guards tightened their grip, dragging him toward execution, while the chamber shuddered beneath the uproar. The chamber fractured into chaos. Alien factions turned on each other, their voices colliding like storms, some demanding humanity's destruction, others crying for reprieve. Archon Varys slammed the gavel, sparks scattering. Order must prevail. But order was gone. Victor Hale shouted above the din, "This judgment has broken the tribunal itself." Mara Keen's eyes darted, calculating escape, but her poise cracked. Celine Eris said, "Your fear of humanity has become your undoing," her voice like a blade through noise. Orion Vex whispered, "Perfect," savoring the collapse. Daniel, still bound, looked at the chaos with a steadiness that unsettled even his captors. The gallery spilled into riot, some climbing rails, others storming toward exits. What had been built to crush one man now began to fall beneath the weight of its own corruption. The conspiracy unraveled in the open. Screens flickered as hidden transmissions leaked, revealing Orion Vex's hand guiding every edit, every distortion. Gasps ripped through the hall as the truth spread. Archon Varys growled, "This court has been manipulated." Victor Hale shouted, "You condemned an entire species on falsehood." Mara Keen's face drained of color, her betrayal now exposed alongside the lies. Celine Eris said, "Truth has broken through your walls, and you cannot bury it again." Orion Vex laughed softly, "Buried truths grow stronger when unearthed." Daniel stood taller though chains bit deeper, his voice cutting through the storm. "You feared us because we endure, and your lies only proved it." The gallery no longer listened to judges, but to the truth unspooling before them. The tribunal's power faltered, collapsing under its own deception. As lies collapsed, a shift rippled through the galaxy itself. Factions began broadcasting live, the tribunal's corruption echoing into countless systems. Archon Varys shouted, "Seal the transmissions," but his words fell hollow. Victor Hale declared, "The galaxy now knows what you have done." Mara Keen whispered, "It was never supposed to reach beyond this chamber," her voice breaking. Selena Riss said, "Your fear became your undoing, and now it has become your legacy." Orion Vex tilted his head, murmuring, "Chaos spreads faster than law." Daniel raised his voice to meet the roar, "You called us guilty, but it is your fear that has been judged." The chamber shook as riots spread, and the tribunal's authority dissolved into open revolt. Dragged once more toward execution, Daniel felt chains bite into blood-soaked wrists, but his voice thundered louder than the gavel. He cried, "You cannot erase us, you cannot bury us. We are already inside you, inside your fear, your memory, your fire." The gallery roared, their chants drowning the tribunal's order. Archon Varys raised his gavel, but found his voice lost beneath the storm. Victor Hale shouted, "The tribunal is finished." Selena Eris stood in solidarity, her gaze fixed on Daniel, as though anchoring hope. Mara Keeney lowered her head, broken by her own betrayal. Orion Vex leaned back, smile widening as though chaos was the only verdict he had ever wanted. Chains rattled, guards faltered, and Daniel stood unbroken, not as victim but as voice. Humanity was not absolved, but it was no longer erased. The tribunal did not collapse, but it could no longer pretend to be whole. A fractured decree emerged like smoke from broken gears. Humanity would live under sanction, watched and warned, scarred but unerased. Archon Varys said, "Existence is conditional," and the words froze the hall. Victor Hale said, "Conditional is still a life," though his voice shook with cost. Mara Keen stared at the floor as if the stone could absolve her math. Selena Riss said, "Mercy that fears itself still shelters breath." Orion Vex was gone, leaving only a ripple of afterthought. Daniel Rook stood with chains removed, wrists marked by the memory of iron. The gallery could not decide whether to cheer or tremble, so it did both and neither. The doors sighed open, and the corridor swallowed ceremony with soft echoes. Daniel walked between guards, who no longer pulled him, only followed. The glass spine of the station looked out on fleets adrift like sleepless moons. Victor Hale said, "History will not forgive me, but I will face it." Mara Keeney did not answer, and silence wrote her name in thin frost. Selena Aris said, "Breathe before they tell you how," and her gaze steadied him. News bands painted the air with verdict and riot and uncertain truces. Archon Varys remained inside, curating a wound and calling it order. Orion Vex left no footprint, only a gap where certainty had stood. Daniel kept walking because stillness now felt like consent. Memory returned with quiet teeth, and Daniel counted the costs as if they were steps. The innocent lay within that count, a light gone but not extinguished in meaning. Victor Hale said, "I will testify to the edits and the lies," and signed with shaking hands. Mara King effaced a circle of her own making, and it closed without ceremony. Selena Aris said, "We will build a record that does not bleed when read." Archon Varys sealed reports with seals that had lost their shine. Orion Vex vanished into Ruma, and Ruma learned new ways to cut. The fleets drifted like questions that no decree could answer. Daniel touched the marks on his wrists and refused to call them destiny. He named them warnings that would breathe as long as he did. A broadcast dais opened to the starfield, and silence arranged itself like an audience. Daniel faced the lenses that stitched systems together in a breath. Victor Hale said, "Speak to the ones who will never sit in courts." Selene Aris said, "Let the warning carry without hate, and it will travel farther." Mara Keen watched from the edge, learning the weight of consequences. Archon Varys authorized the channel with a gesture he could not recall later. Orion Vex remained an absence that drew eyes anyway. Daniel said we endured the theater, and we saw who wrote the script. The transmission left the station like a ship that would never return to harbor. When the lights dimmed, the station breathed like a survivor learning new lungs. Daniel stepped to a window and let the galaxy hold his reflection without verdict. Victor Hale said, "There will be trials after this," and did not mean courts. Selena Riss said, "Walk until the echo fades, then speak again." Mara Keeney set down her rank pins and did not pick them up. Archon Varys catalogued unrest and called it stability for one more report. Orion Vex slipped into myth because myth travels faster than blame. Daniel watched the fleets become patient stars and spoke to no one and everyone. He said they wanted a verdict. What they got was a warning.